Hello, this is the Tavana course, Standards for Free and Fair Elections. My name is Andrew Blick. I am lecturer in Politics and Contemporary History, King's College London, and Director of History and Policy. I was the first research fellow to the first ever United Kingdom parliamentary inquiry into whether or not the UK should adopt a written constitution. As a historian, I focus on constitutional history and the history of democratic development. I've also worked with a number of democratic assessment and reform groups internationally, based in countries including Pakistan, Turkey, and Ukraine. Please watch this lecture before the live discussion session attached to it. Also, after this lecture and before the live discussion session, as required reading, please browse the International IDEA, that's the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance document called International Electoral Standards, Guidelines for Reviewing the Legal Framework of Elections. This is available online as a download. In this lecture today, I'm going to talk about the principles that govern the assessment of elections, the nature of the International IDEA framework, how to actually conduct an assessment, and means of deploying the findings of an assessment as a tool for change. So to begin with, this is really the end product of these lectures, looking at how you should actually go about assessing the nature of an election in Iran, assessing it according to all the democratic principles we've discussed, and then having carried out that assessment, what you can do, what is the value of this assessment from the point of view of reform. So, what is a democratic assessment? If we look particularly from the point of view of the values promoted by IDEA, I think that's a useful starting point. There are a variety of ways of assessing the performance of democracy. There are a number of international bodies which carry out this kind of exercise. They have a lot of shared principles. They accept certain core features that are central to democracy. Certainly, all of them would agree that free and fair elections are critical. However, there are also differences between the different ways of assessing. And I'm going to talk particularly about the IDEA approach, which was based on a method developed in the UK by an organisation for which I have worked, Democratic Audit. I'm going to talk particularly about that method today and the principles which underpin it, the framework that's used, how we go about doing it, and then what we do having done this assessment. So the IDEA approach treats democracy assessment as a qualitative exercise. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that you can't put a simple numerical value, you can't put a simple number when you're trying to measure how democratic a country is. You can't say, well, this country is 7 out of 10, while this country is 8 out of 10. It's not as simple as that. It's much more complicated than that. And you can't say this country was 6.9 last year, this year it's 7.3. it's getting better. And equally, you can't say this country was 9 last year and it's 8.8 this year, it's getting worse. If only it were that straightforward, it's not. Democracy is much more complicated than that. And it's much more complicated in 2 ways. First, you can't simply measure in terms of numbers. It's a qualitative thing. You assess it by considering the way things are, not putting numbers on them. You look at the actual details of how they function rather than simply weighing or measuring them. Second, there's no one particular measure that you can apply. There are lots of different ways in which a democracy can be more or less functional. So if we start with the complexity and the need for qualitative assessment, when we look at a democracy, we have to really understand the details of how it's working, the practicalities, the issues. We need to describe it, not simply attach a number to it. So if we're looking at a society that has been through a long process of historical turbulence, we have to understand that turbulence, we have to describe what's going on. If we're looking at a society that's got major religious divisions, major ethnic divisions, if we're looking at a society that's been a colony or that has been an empire, all of these things have to be described, and at the end of it all, we can't necessarily put a number that can be directly compared to other countries. Each country has got its own specific history, it's got its own specific cultural characteristics, it's got its own specific patterns of development. And if we're going to understand how well it's performing, if it's performing better or worse, it has to be done in the context of that particular country and it's the nature of how it actually has developed historically and the way in which it's configured culturally today. So we have to use a qualitative approach. Now, that doesn't mean we can't compare one country to another, but we have to do so with an awareness of the cultural specificity. At the same time, we have these core democratic values that we apply across the board while understanding that they manifest themselves in different ways in different countries. So that's the kind of need for specificity and quantitative assessment. But there's another dimension to democracy that we've talked about in previous weeks. And when we assess how free and fair elections are, we need to bear this in mind, that there are many different matrices on which we can measure democracy. One may well be, for instance, are parties relatively free to contest elections? Another one may be, do we have a universal franchise? Another one may be, do elections actually make a difference? Are the people who really hold the power actually the ones who are affected by elections? All those are important ways of measuring democracy, although we can't necessarily put a number on them, but they're important. But there are many other measures as well, and again, they all pertain in the end to how effective elections are as free and fair exercises in democracy. For instance, how well is freedom of expression maintained within a country? As we've seen in earlier weeks, that's absolutely critical to a meaningful election. Is there freedom of association? Is there personal security? Is there a sufficient level of education? After all, it's going to be harder for people to play a meaningful part in an election process if they're not educated to a level where they can actually fully investigate the different programs being put forward in an election. Another issue we might look at is how well is the rule of law maintained? That's absolutely critical for all the reasons we've seen. We need an impartial system of rules. We need lack of arbitrary decision making. We need clear rules. We need the possibility for people to complain if they feel that principles of free and fair elections haven't been adhered to. All of that is a way of saying that when we assess things democratically, when we assess democratic performance, we can't do these things in isolation. We can't just look at elections. We have to look at the wider context. And even when we look at elections, there are many different aspects to elections. So there's no simple measurement that can be applied. And that's the kind of assessment I'm talking about. And that's the way we should approach an assessment of an election, to see how free and fair it is, how really democratic it is. That's the way to consider it, in a quantitative way, and in a way that appreciates that there are many different facets of democracy and they are all interconnected. Admittedly, at the centre of them all is certainly a key component, is the conduct of elections, and that's widely accepted as a facet, as a key facet of democracy. So that's the nature of the international idea framework. They have a series of search questions, some of which I referred to in the first lecture, that ask you, in effect, from many different aspects, how democratic is this country? And the questions are loaded in such a way that the further you go along towards answering yes, the closer you are to a desirable democratic outcome, and the further you are from answering yes and the closer you are to answering no, then the less democratic that particular society appears to be, at least measured in that particular way. That's the overall approach. There are search questions. That's the overall framework. We also have a variety of sub-guidance documents we use. So the main framework applies to the whole of democracy and asks across a range of different areas all the different facets we think are important to democracy. But then we have sub-documents, which I'll return to the end, which address specific issues, including elections. So we'll get on to that. So how do you actually go about conducting an assessment? Well, clearly the way in which you can do it is going to be partly dependent upon the kind of society that you're in. But what's crucial is this, that when you conduct an assessment, you gather the widest possible range of different kinds of evidence you can. That's crucial. Whatever is available, you need to get. Now, that will range from international documents telling you what the core principles are, to national level legal documents saying what the rules are, guidance notes at national level saying how the rules should be applied, the constitution of the country, but then also getting beyond the formalities and into what actually happens on the ground. So there may be a real challenge to find out, but you've got to look at issues like reports by international reporting bodies, if they exist, saying how do these principles play out on the ground. We know what the government or the law is committed to in theory. Does this happen in practice? If there are national level groups conducting research and producing recommendations, look at them. What's important is that you gather evidence as widely as possible that looks at the formal position and then also how the actual system plays out on the ground. And it's important to consider both of these aspects, particularly because you can measure the playing out on the ground against the more principled position that may be put forward and see how far there is actually a discrepancy between the two. Having done that, it's possible then to start to make judgments about how far democratic principles are actually being delivered on. In this instance, how far a free and fair election is actually being achieved. But in all you do, it's important when doing this kind of democratic assessment to retain impartiality. This is critical. For the whole exercise of assessment to be credible internally and to the outside world, as far as is possible, it has to be seen to have been conducted from an impartial standpoint. Now, it's plain that the fact that an assessment is being carried out is an indicator that there may be some concern about how well these principles are being adhered to. There may be very many justified complaints that could be had about the electoral system in Iran or other countries, and that's the reason an assessment is needed. But for the purposes of the assessment itself, the exercise has to be impartial. It shouldn't start from the particular point of view that the whole system is flawed and then set out to prove that. It should start by asking the questions and using the approaches suggested in the documentation, gathering the evidence and making an impartial assessment. That may well lead to the conclusion that there are multiple problems, but the exercise should very much be conducted in a spirit of impartiality. Doing that will not undermine its effectiveness as a means of criticising and achieving change. In fact, it will strengthen it, because if people can see that a genuinely impartial exercise found some problems, those problems are going to look a lot more real and a lot less like they're motivated by particular predetermined viewpoints. So that's crucial, that you actually follow through and come to these conclusions on a basis of impartial assessment of the evidence. So there we can see that that's a crucial part of the whole process. And when you go forward next, and this is what I'll talk about next in terms of campaigning for change, how do you achieve, how can you use these proposals as a tool for change? Well, again, timing is really important. You have to find the right time to ask for change, the right time to campaign. So picking a moment in terms of national political cycle, also in terms of international interest, is crucial. But at the same time, nothing should be done which compromises the actual integrity of the research. In other words, if the research is going to take a substantial amount of time, that's what needs to be done. You need to take the amount of time needed to actually properly develop your research and properly present your findings. And then, having done that, find an appropriate point in the political cycle to actually release your findings. When exactly that is partly dependent on the context-specific knowledge that you will have. Another important point to bear in mind is that there's as I'm stressing repeatedly, there is an international audience here. There are people outside Iran, outside other countries, who are interested in what's going on, and you can communicate to them. Even if it's harder to reach internal audiences, you can try and reach people in the outside world and let them know what's going on. And that's where, again, the impartial evidence will be useful, because even people who are already convinced by your case will find it a lot easier to use for their purposes material which is clearly founded in an impartial assessment of what's actually been taking place. And this really leads to my final substantive point, that those of you in country carrying out these assessments are absolutely crucial. However difficult the task may seem, it's absolutely critical that we have people in country, people who know the internal system, people who know how it works, who know the constraints that are placed upon the democratic system in the country, because they've seen how it worked, are the ones carrying out the assessment, if at all possible. That's the way we like to proceed. Those voices have much more credibility in the outside world and indeed inside the country they're operating, more than likely. So that in-country point is critical, and that's why this impartiality issue is also important, because it's shown that they're in the country, but they're also capable of making a dispassionate assessment. In the recommendations you might make, then, it's important that if there is an issue which isn't as much of a problem, or perhaps has even improved on where it was last time, that is noted, because again, that can make it clear that this is a credible assessment. We're not simply on a mission to prove everything is dreadful. We're actually setting out to show what is good or what is less bad and what really needs immediate attention. And that will help put together a program. And potentially, if things which aren't as bad are identified, that's something that can be worked with, that's something that can be built upon, and the reasons why a particular feature is not as bad could help us to understand how we can improve other aspects that are performing less well. So these are all crucial things to take into account when you're carrying out an assessment, the principles behind an assessment, and the actual way of deploying this assessment as a tool for change once it's been achieved. Again, there are a variety of outlets now that perhaps once didn't exist, particularly given the internet and social media, that can be used, that can help you to pursue your goals. And it's clearly a worthwhile exercise. It's been carried out in many countries around the world. I'm now going to talk you through the specific document that you've been asked to look at as part of this assessment, the International Electoral Standards Guidelines for Reviewing the Legal Framework of Elections, to tell you what are the core categories. It asks us to look at the legal framework, how that's structured, the electoral system in use, something we've talked about, boundary delimitation, districting or defining boundaries of electoral units, this boundary issue that we've said is crucial, the right to elect and to be elected, so that's the franchise and the people who can actually run for office, electoral management bodies, an impartial organisation, if such a thing exists, voter registration and voter registers, ballot access for political parties and candidates, democratic electoral campaigns, the campaign, media access and freedom of expression, campaign finance and expenditure, balloting, i.e. the secrecy of the ballot, counting and tabulating votes, the role of representatives of the parties and candidates, electoral observers, the people from outside country who might be allowed in and the people inside country who might be observing, and finally compliance with and enforcement of electoral law. Now, as you can see, all these core issues are things we've been talking about over the past 8 subjects, and they're what you need to focus on if you really want to carry out an impartial assessment of the next election which takes place in your country, to assess it and see how we can possibly make proposals for future reform. Thank you and good luck.